In yonder's valley there grows sweet union. Let us arise and drink our fill. In yonder's valley there grows sweet union. Let us arise and drink our fill. The winter's past and the spring appeareth. The turtle dove is in our land. In yonder's valley there grows sweet union. Let us arise and drink our fill. The winter's past and the spring appeareth. The turtle dove is in our land. In yonder's valley there grows sweet union. Let us arise and drink our fill.
Tried to get a ticket, but it says
In
sold.
wisdom's lovely pleasant ways, I'll spend my days, I'll spend my days. In wisdom's lovely pleasant ways, I'll spend my days, I'll spend my days. I'll learn to watch, to pray and praise, and thus I'll learn your wisdom's ways. I'll learn to watch, to pray and praise, and thus I'll learn your wisdom's ways. In wisdom's lovely pleasant ways, I'll spend my days, I'll spend my days. In wisdom's lovely pleasant ways, I'll spend my days, I'll spend my days. I'll learn to watch, to pray and praise, and thus I'll learn your wisdom's ways. I'll learn to watch, to pray and praise, and thus I'll learn your wisdom's ways. Yielding and simple may I be, like a pliant willow tree, humble in heart, pure and free, pride and bondage spurning. Yielding and simple may I be, like a pliant willow tree, humble in heart, pure and free, pride and bondage spurning. Heavenly zephyrs around me blow, bend and sway me to and fro, cause my soul in truth to grow, and from wrong be turning. Heavenly zephyrs around me blow, bend and sway me to and fro, cause my soul in truth to grow, and from wrong be turning.
Hello, welcome. Just a moment to, okay. Welcome, good evening. My name is Anna Gunther and I'm the events coordinator at the Enfield Shaker Museum. We are excited to host you and Dr. Kenneth W this evening. Hopefully you logged in time to see our introductory slides about the Enfield Shaker Museum, this particular series of lectures, other upcoming online programming, and to keep you metaphorically warm during this chilly part of the year, some images of beautiful Enfield Shaker stoves from our collection. As we face globally the present and future impacts of climate change, we felt it would be timely to look into the past to investigate how weather has historically shaped the way humans live. Weather is central to daily existence, from our food and clothing to buildings and natural resources utilized to keep us cool, warm, healthy, and safe. Except for extraordinary weather events such as hurricanes, droughts, tornadoes, daily weather is often simply accommodated. As one shaker observed, the weather is good, bad, or indifferent. Can we find through historical records what the Shakers ate when a drought or storm ruined their well-tended crops? What was the interplay between inclement weather and Shaker rules about clothing? How did the Shakers alter their built environment to ensure protection from the sun, rain, wind, and ample snow? What technologies, such as the heating stoves featured in our introductory slides, did the Shakers adopt and adapt to survive and thrive in Enfield, New Hampshire? We will be researching these questions, among others, in the coming months. Tonight, we turn our attention to how to research these interdisciplinary questions through a thought-provoking study on the impact of weather on the American Civil War. Thanks to a generous grant from New Hampshire Humanities, the museum staff and volunteers are undertaking this year-long exploration on the impact of weather on Enfield Shakers. The first of a four-part series. The series in total will explore the impact of weather on historical events, weather events as history, and how Americans have documented weather over time. We'll be creating an exhibit exploring the Enfield Shakers and weather, combining historical research and craft for a visually impactful interdisciplinary exhibit utilizing textiles as a primary display medium. In the fall of the year, the museum will host a book group reading fictional and non-fictional works in which weather factors significantly. Throughout the entire year, we'll be posting weather-related Shaker history to our museum social media accounts and our blog. In the first talk in our Weatherwise series, Dr. Kenneth W explores how the Civil War's unusual weather affected both the battlefield and the home front. Traditional histories of the Civil War describe a conflict between the North and South. Dr. W suggests a more comprehensive understanding as a war between the North and South and the weather. And he's here to talk to us about that book tonight, The Howling Storm, Weather, Climate, and the American Civil War. Dr. W is the Drawn Professor of Southern History at Auburn University. An award-winning teacher and scholar, Dr. W is the author or editor of 8 books, numerous articles and essays, winning awards for his scholarship, including a Pulitzer Prize nomination. In 2020, Auburn University honored Dr. W with a faculty award for creative research and scholarship. Dr. W is here to speak to us tonight on his latest work, and we at the museum would like to wish good luck to Ken, whose book is a finalist for the prestigious Lincoln Prize, which will be announced tomorrow on Abraham Lincoln's birthday. So good luck, Ken.
Thank you.
And speaking of prizes, we have a copy of The Howling Storm that we will draw a winner from tonight's participants at the end of the program. I will be back at the end of the program to announce our book winner and say goodnight, but for now it is with pleasure that I invite Dr. Kenneth W to our virtual stage.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you very much. Greetings to all of you from Auburn, Alabama, where it is 65 degrees, and we are just recovering from a thunderstorm. Not a particularly howling storm, but a storm nonetheless. And I'm certainly glad the power is still on. And as much as I like being in Auburn, Alabama, I would love to be in Enfield tonight. My wife and I have been interested in Shakers and Shaker villages really since we met in the 1980s. We've gone to many Shaker villages. We spent a wonderful afternoon at Enfield 3 years ago, and I would dearly, dearly love to be on that campus tonight rather than speaking to you from our spare bedroom where you can see my closet doors, but we will make do. I'm going to go to a PowerPoint for a few minutes and say a little bit about Civil War weather, and then I will come back and hopefully we'll have time for questions, and hopefully you will have questions, which I will be happy to take through the chat function. moment for you to see the PowerPoint presentation. So let's talk about Civil War weather. The Howling Storm, climate, and the American Civil War. As Anna Gunther mentioned, this is the 8th book that I have written or edited, and 4 of those books actually have titles that I picked. For some reason, publishers don't always like my titles. This time, though, the problem was a little bit different. Every time I came up with a title for this book that I was writing, somebody else ended up using it. And so I actually reached a point where the book was done. I was going through it one last time before sending it off to the publisher, and I did not have a title. But luckily, as I was going through the manuscript, looking for errors and typographical errors and that sort of thing, I happened upon a quotation that I almost forgot about. The man you see here in the slide is Henry Kidd Douglas, native Virginian. In the summer of 1862, he was on Stonewall Jackson's staff. And he wrote a particularly poignant account of the night after the Battle of Malvern Hill. Malvern Hill was fought outside of Richmond, July 1st, 1862. It was the last of the so-called 7 days battles. That entire week of fighting had been shaped by heat and thunderstorms. But the night of the 1st, as the Union Army retreated under George McClellan back down the river a few miles, as the Confederates hung on to the field, it began to rain. It rained in torrents. It rained all night. And Henry Kidd Douglas was wandering around that field in the darkness, in the rain, in the mud, among the wounded and the killed. And he later wrote, "The howling of the storm, the cry of the wounded and groans of the dying, the glare of the torch upon the faces of the dead, or into the shining eyes of the speechless wounded, looking up in hope of relief, the ground slippery with a mixture of mud and blood, all in the dark, hopeless, starless night. Surely it was a gruesome picture of war at its most horrid shape." I think if I only had 5 minutes to speak, as opposed to 30 or 35, we might just stop there, because in a nutshell, I think that's the experience of the Civil War once we factor the environment, once we factor the weather into it. We have spent 150 years talking about the cry of the wounded and the groans of the dying, and the blood, and the fighting, but somehow we've forgotten the storms, the mud, the dark, hopeless, starless nights. And as you can imagine, once I read through this passage one more time, I had my title. What I want to suggest to you, what Anna has already mentioned, is that we have in the past tended to think about the Civil War as if it took place in a climate-controlled environment, in some sort of sports dome. And so if a general like George McClellan couldn't march 20 or 25 miles a day up the peninsula in Virginia to get to Malvern Hill, then surely it was because he was a coward, or because he was petulant, or because he was incompetent, but surely not because the mud was so thick that it was almost impossible to move his army. Judged from our air-conditioned or heated offices, from our classrooms, from our dens, it's easy to make those judgments, which is why I argue that if we're fully going to understand the American Civil War, we have to take it back outside. Now, I will confess, the first time I ever gave a talk about the Civil War and weather, I used this phrase because I thought it was funny. I thought it was a joke. I got up in front of a crowd of distinguished historians and I said, the Civil War was fought outdoors. And I thought people would laugh, but no one laughed. They took me seriously. And in time, I started to take myself seriously when I said that. Sometimes we forget that the Civil War was fought outdoors, fought in the environment, fought in the rain, the snow, the heat, the dust. Environmental historians use an interesting phrase. They say that they want to give the environment agency when they study the past. That doesn't mean that the environment has a brain, that it's thinking, it's doing logical things to block one army or to help another, to help a community of Shakers like those at Enfield have bountiful crops and a wonderful harvest one year and struggle and drought the next. But it's active. It's a player. It's not background scenery. And so I do adopt a conceit in this book and in my topic tonight, whenever I talk about the Civil War and weather, that instead of thinking of the war as we classically did, as a struggle between the blue and the gray, we need to think about it as a war between the blue, the gray, and the weather. The weather, a non-aligned power, which more often than not supported the Union cause, but not always. Sometimes the weather supported the Confederates. Weather almost seemed to be dragging out the war, preventing an easy victory, extending that conflict until it included emancipation and freedom and all of the other changes that 4 years of terrible fighting brought. I grew up on a farm. Well, I grew up near a farm, a mile away from a farm. I was on the farm a lot. It was my grandparents' farm. And weather was really important in my house. We had to know, was it going to rain that day? Should we get the hay up? When should we plant? Do we have to stock in food because a snowstorm is coming? And make sure our animals can eat. So I've thought about the importance of weather all my life. I suppose those of you watching from the Northeast have had the same experience. You can't really ignore the weather in the way that sometimes we can down here in the South. But I never really thought about the Civil War and weather until about 20 years ago, a little over 20 years ago, when I was invited to write a book on the Civil War Battle of Perryville. If you don't know Perryville, it was the largest battle fought in the state of Kentucky. It's one of the more important battles in the Western theater, October 8th, 1862. I knew a little bit about Perryville. I'd been to Perryville. I will confess that one of my first dates with my wife was going to the battlefield at Perryville. She was trying to impress me. She did a great job. But I didn't know a lot about it, other than the basics. So when I started studying the Battle of Perryville, I soon realized that the weather, again, was a major player. The entire campaign, the so-called Kentucky campaign, in the summer and fall of 1862, fought in a drought. Battle itself began as a fight for water. I began to really think about how weather had affected that campaign, and not only that campaign, but other campaigns. The tremendous rain that fell at the beginning of 1862 that caused the flooding that so importantly shaped the battles of Fort Henry and Donelson in Tennessee, and the 7 Days Campaign in Virginia. And I would start telling my classes, someone should write a book about Civil War weather. I think I turned that into a cliche. I said it every year. But in fact, no one really did. And so after several years, I decided to do that myself. not knowing that the experience of researching and writing a book on Civil War weather was going to change my understanding of the Civil War entirely. Let's talk about Southpaw Freeman there on the right. Noted Civil War historian, biographer of R.E. Lee. Not long before he died in the 1950s, he said that a book on Civil War weather was one of the most important things we could still have in the field. And he begged historians to start putting together data so we could better understand what weather was like during this conflict. And yet that didn't happen in the 1950s or the 60s. And so there I was roughly 10 or 12 years ago, thinking about taking this project on myself. Now, that's not to say that Civil War historians have not written about weather. They have, in all sorts of different ways. In regimental histories and memoirs, the veterans described the weather of the Civil War themselves. There on the upper left, we see William Child's classic history of the 5th New Hampshire, one of my sources for Howling Storm. Historians who write about battles, like my Perryville book, certainly have to deal with the weather context. Some do it more than others. Some barely mention the weather. Some go into more detail. Historians of the common soldier, going all the way back to Bell Wiley in the 1940s and 1950s, his life of Johnny Reb and life of Billy Yank. Talk about the life of soldiers in the environment. What was it like to march through the rain? What was it like to build cabins in the winter and try to survive the blasts of ice and cold? We also see weather in popular culture. I have a photo there, the sleeve of the movie Glory. I always think about that scene in Glory when the regiment, 54th Massachusetts, is still in camp at Reedville Camp, Boston. And Morgan Freeman's character is just marching back and forth in this incredible downpour. It reminds us of what common soldiers experienced. Those of us who go to battlefields understand that weather conditions not only can shape battles, but can shape our touring of those battlefields. Toward the bottom, you see my friend Daryl Black, who is the manager of the Seminary Ridge Museum in Gettysburg. I want to ask Daryl, when you're in uniform, when you're out doing living history, meeting people as a Civil War soldier, what's the number one question people ask you? And he said, people ask me every day, aren't those wool uniforms hot? So we think about weather. But what I want to suggest to you is that everything I just mentioned, the regimental histories, the battle narratives, the movies, the reenactments, everything, we never linked those together. I say here on the slide, connecting the dots, because we never really got around to connecting those dots to try to understand the total picture and why it was important, why we needed to know the total picture of the weather context of what I'm saying before technology intervened is that there's a marvelous collection of weather data that the Smithsonian Institution started collecting in the 1840s, volunteers from around the country. Bob Crick essentially built his book using one weather watcher in Washington, D.C. I ended up using a lot of them. They're wonderful sources if you're doing your own history of a region, New Hampshire, wherever you are in the United States, at least. This material is available at National Archives. And it's wonderful if you're trying to understand the weather history of a particular region or of the country as a whole. What about Civil War weather? First of all, I should tell you that Civil War weather, to use the technical term, was actually kind of weird. It was not normal. It was not typical. It would be incorrect to think that, well, the weather during the early 1860s was exactly like what we have now. In fact, one of the more interesting things that I discovered in my research is that Civil War weather was quite unusual for the 19th century, and I think through American history as a whole. There had been, as I'm sure many of you know, I didn't put it on the slide, the so-called Little Ice Age, which was a period of cooling, which coincided with the settlement of New England, all the way up into the 19th century, certainly up through the period when Enfield was being established. It comes to an end, according to meteorologists, somewhere between the 1830s and 1850s. More aligned to the Civil War was the Great Western Drought, which began about 1845, lasted through the American Civil War, became even worse in the late 1850s. Meteorologists have long been talking about the so-called Great Civil War Drought, which began in 1856 and lasted through the war. This was an incredibly dry period west of the Mississippi. And it was a period that had all sorts of effects on American history at that time, notably what it did to the Plains peoples who had been so dependent on the buffalo until their grass started to die. But there were exceptions. There were moments when drought ended, such as the Great California Megaflood of December 1861, January 1862, which remains the worst flooding in the recorded history of California, stretched all the way to British Columbia in the north and Utah to the east. This itself was unusual. This was also a period, the Civil War period, when the El Nino Southern Oscillation was quite active, although meteorologists are still arguing about how exactly it was active. And so, as you may know, a very, very complicated system, essentially involving a sort of metaphorical seesaw stretching between the western coast of Peru and modern Indonesia. The water off of Peru is usually quite cold, but in some years, for various reasons that are still being debated, the seesaw quits working. A metaphorical conveyor belt starts running in the opposite direction. The waters off of South America begin to warm up. Warmer temperatures rise into the atmosphere, the Gulf Stream switches, and our weather changes throughout the United States and much of the world. We mostly know El Nino for what we see on TV in terms of mudslides in California, but in fact, it affects North America as a whole. Now, as I said, there's some disagreement as to what was actually happening with El Nino during the war. Some in the past have posited that the war itself was an extended La Nina period, La Nina, the so-called extreme normal period. But more recent scholars, Richard Grove and George Adamson, I mentioned here, suggest that there were, in fact, two major El Nino systems operating during the Civil War, beginning in December 1861 and running through 1862, and then again beginning in December 1863 and extending through 1864. Our local TV meteorologists talk a lot about El Nino. They often don't talk about one that is probably even more important to the East Coast, more important to you, more important to many of the participants in the Civil War, and that was the North Atlantic Oscillation. Another one of those seesaws, if you will, or conveyor belts that runs between Iceland to the north, a permanent low pressure system in and around Iceland, and to a permanent high pressure system down in the Azores. And sometimes the difference between those pressure systems becomes smaller or larger, and that affects weather in the United States. And we know that a so-called negative North Atlantic Oscillation was happening in 1862, 1864, and 1865. And what that would mean, what that still means: cold and heavy snow in the Northeast, cold and heavy snow for you folks in New Hampshire, and cold weather certainly for us in the South. So these were years when both the North Atlantic Oscillation and El Nino were operating. And the end result of that, well, we can see it here. Summer and fall of 1861, when we know that La Nina was certainly operating. Extremely, extremely hot. 100-degree weather at the Battle of Wilson's Creek, the first major battle in the West. In December 1861, first there was snow, and then it got really warm. Flowers started blooming. People were writing about how they had never seen a winter, a December like this. And then right at the end of December, it became incredibly cold, which seems to involve an active El Nino. Again, the jury's still out, but it certainly seems that way. January, and indeed the spring of 1862, unusually cold and wet, to the degree that farmers lost a month trying to get their crops into the field. So everything's being planted late. In some areas, they are replanting because everything has just died. Wet springs. This is also the spring of the flooding I mentioned at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson and on the peninsula. Then in the summer and fall of 1862, the rain just suddenly stopped. And aside from a few thunderstorms, there was no rain really almost until the Thanksgiving holidays. Drought extended across the South. So here were farmers, here were fields planted late and now parching because of the lack of moisture later on in the year. And as bad as 1862 was in terms of drought, following extreme rain, it happened again in 1863. And at least in Missouri, Virginia, and finally in the North, all the way up into New England, it happened again in 1864. Too much rain and drought in the Confederacy meant hunger. Hunger meant the government in Richmond making very hard decisions about what to do with the limited food supply. Do we feed the Army or do we feed the civilians? The Jefferson Davis administration made the decision to feed the Army. Civilians were suddenly being told that they had to give up a lot of the little food they had. This created all sorts of dissension. We Civil War historians talk about a concept called internalism. Why did the Confederacy lose the Civil War? Internalists suggest that it fell apart from within. That policies coming out of Richmond alienated the poor, the yeoman class, most women of any class. Certainly the African-American population was never on board to begin with. And we've had this discussion about internalism for decades, without really understanding that it began with these strange weather conditions that created the lack of food in the first place. Other examples I could give you: incredible early frosts from Canada down through the Midwest, all the way into Tennessee and Georgia in August and September of 1863. If you're familiar at all with the Civil War Battle of Chickamauga, you might know the armies moving toward Chickamauga were complaining about how hot it was. And then the night before the battle, it became so cold that they were shivering. And then the coldest days of the American Civil War. January 1st, 1864, west of the Appalachian Mountains. January 2nd, 1864, east of the Appalachian Mountains, temperatures dropping sometimes 30, 40 degrees as a massive Arctic front moved across the United States. Unexpected by most people, although I will add, since I'm speaking to many of you in New England tonight, New Englanders, many of them actually saw it was coming. The Portland, Maine newspaper had reported that people should be aware that the beginning of January could be incredibly cold because muskrats were double walling their shelters, their homes. And that was a sure sign that cold weather was coming. We don't consult with muskrats anymore, but apparently they knew what they were doing at the beginning of 1864. Unusual weather in the American Civil War stunted agriculture in the Confederacy. The Confederate founding fathers could not have picked a worse time to try to create an agricultural republic. And that drought certainly spread into the North in 1864, where it actually became an issue in Abraham Lincoln's campaign. Why wasn't the Lincoln administration doing a better job of feeding Northerners who were suddenly going hungry because of drought? We have internalists, but we also have externalists who argue that the Civil War was really won or lost on the battlefield. We should focus on the battlefield as opposed to the home front. But even there, it is impossible to ignore the effect of weather, be it the snow and ice and sleet at Fort Donelson, the heavy rain that followed the Battle of Gettysburg and that allowed Lee's army to escape south and eventually across a flooded Potomac. We see Abraham Lincoln in the lower left corner, Fort Stevens in Washington, watching Union forces successfully defend the nation's capital in 100-degree weather. And had it not been so hot, the Confederates surely would have gotten there a day before and almost certainly would have gone into Washington. Good weather, though, as well as bad weather, affects the Civil War. Here we see a famous illustration of Sherman's march through Georgia. And when Sherman had marched through Georgia and got to Savannah, he assured Washington that one of the reasons he had been so successful was that the weather was perfect. Not too hot, not too cold, very little rain. The historian David Ludlam called it Yankee weather. A few years ago, I tried to quantify how weather conditions affected particular battles and campaigns, and I finally gave up because, in fact, it affected and shaped all of them, many of them in dramatic ways. I want to save time for questions, so let me just make one last point here, and I will turn it over to all of you watching tonight. One of the books that affected me very much when I was beginning my project was a book by Mike Davis. It's called Late Victorian Holocausts. It's a history of imperialism in the 19th century. It's a history of how a handful of nations in Europe managed to take over much of the world. And when I teach, or at least when I used to teach imperialism in my world history classes, we would talk about things like machine guns and quinine and steam engines and steamboats. But Mike Davis points out that between 1877 in 1902, 3 massive El Nino systems brought monsoon or drought to much of Asia and Africa, and probably killed between 30 and 50 million people. Those El Nino moments and local governments' inability to deal with those governments because the British or the French or the Germans or whoever had undermined those efforts, caused disaster. And it's a base reason of why the Europeans were so successful. Mike Davis calls that the secret history of the 19th century. My argument is that if we take the Civil War back outside, if we put it out in the environment, if we put it out in the weather, if we understand how the weather affected the home front, how it affected common soldiers, how it affected battles, campaigns. What we have, I think, is what has been up to now a secret history of the Civil War. I don't know if I've convinced you. I hope you take a look at my book at some point. But I will say this. My research has convinced me. As I said a few minutes ago, I don't think I'll ever look at the war the same way again. Once we've taken it back outside, I don't think we should try to put it back in our air-conditioned offices. With that, I'm going to stop. I see that we have some people popping in already, both in the chat function and in the Q&A function. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes and try to answer any questions that you might have. I encourage you to send me your thoughts. Norman Dykstra has just done so. He says he's reading a book now about Kearny's 1st Jersey Brigade and how pickets on guard duty froze to death in winter camp. It is absolutely true. I don't know that it happened a lot, but it certainly happened. We see it every winter of the war. Pickets are very exposed. Pickets, if you don't know, are not in the main camp. They're out there in that sort of no man's land between the two armies. They're usually told they can't start fires because it will attract the attention of the other side's artillery. They're putting up whatever shelter they can, which tends to be pretty bad in many cases. Sometimes they're building shelters out of corn stalks, for example, or just putting their blankets over their head. And yes, men froze to death during the Civil War. We think of soldiers dying of disease or mini balls, but we don't think about them freezing or burning to death when they're wounded and a dry forest catches on fire. We don't think about them drowning. We don't think about them choking to death on dust. All of those things happened. All of those things happened. I think we've forgotten that somehow. Greg Daler, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, Greg. Pardon me if I'm not. The book ends with a sort of teaser. Are you working on a book of how weather affected Reconstruction? I'm not. I'm leaving that to someone else. I'm retiring in a couple of months. I'm not sure I've got another 12-year project ahead of me, but I really hope that somebody will take up that project. The strongest El Nino of the 1860s is the one that begins in December 1865. And there's another one that comes along later on during Reconstruction. Very good historian at St. Olave's College in Minnesota, Mike Fitzgerald, has argued that Reconstruction was actually starting to work in the late 60s until that El Nino again brought hunger and famine to the South and gave conservative Democrats an opportunity to stir up more trouble, if you will. And I will add, just as we need historians to look at Reconstruction in environmental context, there are still more things to try to understand in the Civil War, I think. I've written a big book. It was supposed to be a 2-volume book. I cut out 300 pages and it became a 1-volume book, but it's still kind of thick. Whoever wins the book tonight, it's going to be a heavy package. And people assume it must be the last word on Civil War weather. It actually isn't. I know what I didn't get to cover. I didn't get to cover lives of men in coastal forts in places like Portsmouth, New Hampshire, along the Maine coast. I didn't do much with the guerrilla war. I didn't deal much with emancipation. I think we really need to understand the process of emancipation in an environmental context. Some historians have done that. I recommend Amy Taylor's work, but there's so much more that we can do just with the Civil War in terms of broadening our understanding of it by putting it into that weather context, that environmental context. Let's see what else we hear. I'm going over to Q&A. How and why did the weather favor either the Union or the Confederacy in some specific battles? Surely the weather would affect both or not. Some examples. Sure, Colin Osborne, it's a great question. The retreat from Gettysburg. Starts raining the night of the 3rd, and the battle's over. It pretty much rains for the next 2 weeks with a couple of days sort of dry. When Lee's army makes it down to the Potomac, they're stuck. Potomac is flooded. There's every reason to think that Meade's army can destroy them. Except Meade's army is marching south in that same weather. As soon as they get off the turnpikes, they get into a very unusual little section of Pennsylvania where red clay predominates. Red clay is largely southern soil, but there's a little finger of it that pokes up into Pennsylvania. And as soon as they get off the road, they get bogged down. By the time Meade gets his armies to the mountains, 2 of his corps have to cross without their animals because they've worn out their animals in the early days of the pursuit. The weather blocks Lee, but then it protects Lee. And then at a certain moment, the Potomac starts to lessen, and then it starts to build up again. And that's the moment when Lee's able to get his army across. So that's an example of a battle. In terms of the war as a whole, the Union Army was better prepared to deal with weather. They had rubber ponchos, they had better equipment, they had better supply. So most of the time, the weather generally helps them. But there are moments when it does not. McClellan trying to come up the peninsula is a classic example of that. What does the Peninsula Campaign do? It drags out the war. I mean, McClellan doesn't take Richmond in 1862, but as a very good historian, Glenn Brasher argues, up until McClellan's failure to take Richmond, emancipation was on the back burner. It was that failure that pushed Congress toward the Second Confiscation Act, and eventually that pushes Abraham Lincoln toward the Emancipation Proclamation. It changes the war. Had there been quote unquote normal weather on the peninsula in 1862, the war might have ended very, very differently. And finally, I would just say you're absolutely right to point out that one side's good weather is another side's bad weather very often. And again, the not the Atlanta campaign, the March to the Sea, the Confederacy needed bad weather. They needed flooding. They needed Sherman to be stopped by high water, and that didn't happen. Anonymous attendee, what was the impact of weather on pack animals and material transport? It's a wonderful, wonderful question. I was writing an article about this at one point. Most of it ended up in the book. The death toll among draft animals, not just pack animals, but I'll say draft animals as a whole, those animals pulling wagons, was incredibly horrible. Perhaps 1 million die. There's not a lot of care or concern for horses and mules in this war, and they are pushed in good weather and bad, and in bad weather especially, they are pushed to death. In campaign after campaign, certainly winter campaign, Fredericksburg comes to mind immediately, but there are others. Soldiers write about marching down roads where there's just one dead draft animal or pack animal after another, to the point that they said they could hop from one to another. It was as an animal lover, someone who grew up on a farm, it's a terrible, terrible vision of what that war brought. To the degree that between battlefield death, death due to neglect, bad weather, environmental concerns, and a particularly bad glanders epidemic that took place in 1862, it took the South years and years and years to get its numbers of horses and mules back up to where it was in 1860. And that certainly has an effect on Reconstruction too. If I was writing about Reconstruction, I would have to mention that. It's remarkable how horrible this war was for the animals who were dragged into it against their will. Do generals have any weather forecasting technology? Agnes Burt writes. And if so, how far in advance could they predict the weather? They had none whatsoever. This was a world, a mindset in the 1860s where people were still trying to predict weather based on the sky or muskrats. There was the beginnings of our modern weather system. I mentioned the Smithsonian, Director Joseph Henry, fairly well-known scientist, James Pollard Espy, the so-called Storm King. They were starting to think that there might be a way to predict weather someday. They were starting to think, this was a remarkable idea in the 1840s, that weather that affects one part of the country might actually affect other parts of the country, that all weather was not normal, but that in fact there might be larger systems moving around the country, moving around the world. In fact, the Smithsonian Project was actually designed to try to prove that. The idea was to create what they called synoptic meteorology. If we can have all this information from all these other parts of the country, and if somebody can put it together, maybe we can see those patterns. Long before Norwegian meteorologists came up with the notion of warm fronts and cold fronts, the things that we see on the news every night. Espy and Pollard were thinking about this in the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, but all they were doing in this period was collecting data. So no, they had absolutely no idea what was causing the weather. Pardon me. To the degree that a lot of soldiers were absolutely convinced that they themselves were affecting the weather. They were convinced, a lot of them were convinced anyway, that artillery battles created rain. It happened enough. They ignored all the times when it didn't happen. The federal government later in the century actually provides money and funding and a whole lot of surplus cannons for people to try to prove that this was real, that they could change the weather through using artillery or explosions. And as late as the Great Depression, I mean, people were traveling around Oklahoma and the Dust Bowl promising to bring rain with their Civil War era surplus howitzer. Our ability to sort of understand the weather that's coming down the pike in the next week or two is a 20th century thing. They had no idea whatsoever, except old wives' tales and trying to understand nature and red sky at morning, sailor take warning, and that sort of thing. Which is why they make a lot of the decisions they do. I don't see any other questions from you. And I know that we are approaching 7 o'clock. Oh, here are a couple more. Here's some more coming in. I'll try to answer these really quickly. I don't know why, they all just popped up at once. Very exciting. I came across a letter from a soldier in the Michigan 24th charged with protecting Washington during the war. He wrote his parents to say it had rained so much that the patriotism had been washed out of him. It's a wonderful quote. I wish I'd seen it when I was writing the book, but it's a pretty common sentiment, I assure you. Michael Dennis is 7 miles from Perryville right now. I probably know exactly where you are, and have been interested in the drought at Doctors Creek ever since moving here from Maine in I don't think you moved there in 2007 perhaps. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, it's an enormously fascinating battle and the effect that the drought had on that entire campaign. For this book, I actually went back and looked at Perryville again. I hadn't looked at it in 20 years. And one of the things I tried to add to my account this time was the fact that most of these men had to be sick. They had marched up from Alabama, in some cases in Tennessee, drinking bad water, drinking scum-covered water, water where the other side had thrown dead horses and mules in, in effect poison it. I think a lot of the men who fought Perryville were completely sick, dehydrated, and it probably affected their performance. I don't know how we can prove it, but I think it had to affect how that battle went. There's Colin's question. I've seen that before. In the Iraq War, soldiers bought some of their own equipment, like flak jackets. Did Civil War soldiers make or buy special equipment or clothes? They absolutely did. At the beginning of the War Department thought it was absolutely unnecessary to furnish soldiers with rubber ponchos, even though rubber ponchos were available. And for a while, soldiers had to buy those themselves. Eventually, they become more issued to Union soldiers. The Confederates never have rubber ponchos. At least they can't manufacture them. They don't have the know-how. They try to get by with painting blankets, which doesn't work very well. And so when a Confederate Army, brigade, division moves to Union camps, one of the things they often will do is stop and try to get things they need, like tents and rubber ponchos, and sutlers, salesmen, if you will, wagons full of equipment, of food, other things that soldiers might want, always traveled with the Army. So they're always trying to buy things they might need. Another item that they aren't furnished at all, that they buy themselves if they can, stoves, little metal camp stoves for their tents or winter cabins. Those are never issued. They have to buy those themselves, or else they get by with all sorts of other expedients, fireplaces and other ways of heating winter quarters. So yeah, they're on their own, surprisingly, I think, given the industrial might of the Union. Norman Dykstra, again, fascinating way to look at the war. Thank you, I appreciate that. it was a new way for me to look at the war. And I told people I learned so much in every chapter. Did the Civil War have settlers like the French and Indian War? Well, I could see through the future and answer that one. They absolutely did. They absolutely did. And are permitted and need encouraged to travel with the armies to provide those items that soldiers might want that the government did not see fit to provide. Sorry about that.
Ken, I think we have 2 more questions in the Q&A
Yes.
function, if you want to get to those, and then.
Wonderful. Jacqueline Fraser, Mike Davis connected climate and weather with British imperial consequences, specifically famine and the devaluation of the silver standard in favor of the gold. How would you say is your book framed in terms of consequences? I think the outcome of the war, as it existed in 1865, is very much shaped by the weather. I think a war that would have ended quickly could have been a war that ended with a reunited United States without a 13th Amendment, a country where slavery was still legal and could have been legal for a while. I certainly think it affected campaigns and the outcome of the war in that way. It undermined the Confederacy from within. There's no doubt that those bad weather conditions undermined the Confederacy to the degree that made it very hard, or would have made it very hard for them to triumph, unless they could have done it early. So I'm not a historian who does a lot of what ifs, but I think had the weather been different, the outcome of the war would have been different, and it might have ended differently. Even with all the other positive factors that the Union possessed, it could have ended differently. How did winter weather affect the armies of the Civil War? Well, in all sorts of ways. Some generals, Joseph Johnston comes to mind, did not want to fight in the winter. They wanted to go into winter quarters, ride it out, sort of spend Valley Forge winters. But there were other commanders, notably U.S. Grant, William Tecumseh Sherman, and their commander-in-chief, Abraham Lincoln, who had no interest in stopping the war in the winter at all. And so they continued to press for winter campaigns. We weren't always successful. George McClellan managed to hold off the president in the winter of 1861-62. Ambrose Burnside could not do that the following year, if we think about Fredericksburg and then the Mud March. And it's very interesting that while many Army commanders north and south believe that weather is a decisive factor, Lincoln and Grant both believed that it was just something that had to be dealt with and conquered like everything else. And so we did have winter campaigns, and you do have everything you might associate with a winter campaign. Things we've talked about: men freezing to death, animals dying, inconclusive campaigns in some ways. There's also a lot in the book I will mention if you're interested in this sort of thing. I got really interested in winter shelter. And it was interesting watching winter shelter evolve year by year by year. And the Confederates doing it one way and the Federals doing it another way, and experimenting and finding ways to protect themselves in the winter when they weren't on active campaign. So that's an interesting part of the story too. It's really a sort of vernacular architecture that we've never studied very much. To what extent did telegraph play in relaying weather information? Sometimes they're writing back and forth about weather conditions. Samuel Curtis trying to tell Henry Halleck how bad things were in Missouri, but not as much as you might think, because there's really no sense of even regional weather information being useful. Soldiers and commanders are dealing with what's right there in front of them. And sometimes they're trying to explain to their superiors why they didn't do this or why they did this in terms of the weather. But there's not a whole lot of weather data being sent back and forth by the telegraph. What do scientists believe to be the cause of the Little Ice Age? They're still debating that one. Scientists are still debating why the Earth heats up and then cools down at certain points. Let's see, Wayne Rowe, blue-gray weather. I would add other key factors such as logistics and landscape affect the war and battles, plus new technologies. Absolutely agree with that. And I'll only say, you know, in my small little partial defense, logistics are affected by weather. Wagons, wagon trains, getting supplies to the Army from the railhead up to the front, affected by weather, landscape, troops moving through the Blue Ridge Mountains in the winter. Yeah, I think it affects all of that too. I mean, you're right to point that out. Earl Hess has a couple of wonderful new books out on logistics and feeding armies. I strongly recommend those. But when you read Earl's books, you'll see that he even is talking about how weather affected supply.
Okay, I think we are hitting our time limit here. So, Dr. Noe, do you have any final words before I announce our book winner?
Really, just to say thanks. Thanks to you, Shirley, and everyone at Enfield, and thanks for everybody for joining me tonight. It was really nice to see those numbers of participants pop up. I appreciate you taking an hour or so out of your life to listen to another Zoom presentation, and thank you so much for that.
Thank you for being here, and thank you for being here at home. This has been the first, as I mentioned, in a four-part lecture series regarding weather history brought to you by the Enfield Shaker Museum and New Hampshire Humanities. You can find information about upcoming programs on our website, our social media, and my wonderful coworker, Catherine, is going to drop some links to future weather-wise lectures and future Enfield Shaker Museum online programming if you are interested in the chat. All right, tonight's winner of our book draw for a copy of The Howling Storm, which we will mail to you, is Deborah Lang of South Sutton, New Hampshire. So congratulations, Deborah. And to everyone, we thank you again for joining us, and we enthusiastically invite you to share your thoughts and share your feedback with us so that we can continue to provide stimulating and engaging programming that you want to see. When you exit the screen, when the webinar is over, you'll be directed to a short survey, and we would appreciate it so much if you could take a few minutes to complete the anonymous evaluation. We hope to see you at our next lecture on Thursday, March 11th for the history of the Great New England Hurricane as documented by the people. And have a great night.